The purpose of the Plaas Incorporated Cadmium Safety Program is to protect both our employees and the environment from cadmium contamination from our facility operations. The intent of our program is to be a full, continuous compliance with OSHA Standard 29 CFR 1910-1026 and all other local, state, and federal requirements for our industry. Responsibilities. Management will implement, maintain, and monitor effectiveness of the entire cadmium safety program, including semi-annual revisions and updates to reflect the current status of the program. Engineering and administrative controls for cadmium exposure. Employee training and awareness. Medical surveillance program. Respiratory protection program. Cadmium disposal program. Housekeeping program. Protective clothing issue, storage, and disposal. Supervisors will provide effective and continuous control of all cadmium operations, immediately inform management of any deficiencies in engineering or administrative controls, conduct routine assigned inspections and monitoring, immediately correct any deviation from operational safety requirements, provide immediate on-the-spot training for any employee who shows a lack of knowledge or application of required operational cadmium safety requirements. All employees who have the potential exposure prior to the time of initial job assignment and annually shall be trained. The employees shall be informed of the specific nature of the operations which could result in exposure to cadmium above the action level, the purpose, proper selection, fitting and use, and limitation of respirators, engineering controls, purpose, and a description of the medical surveillance program and the medical removal program. Employees will follow all operational and cadmium safety procedures, seek immediate supervisor guidance to resolve questions, conduct operations in accordance with company-provided training, report immediately to a supervisor in any deficiency in engineering or administrative controls, properly use, store, and dispose of issued and assigned personal protective clothing, maintain, change, and shower areas neat and orderly. Cadmium, in its natural element form, cadmium is either a blue-white metal or a grayish-white powder found in lead, copper, and zinc sulfide ores, but most cadmium compounds are highly colored from brown to yellow and red. Cadmium's uses vary from an electrode component in alkaline batteries to a stabilizer in plastics. Scope and application. The final cadmium rule for the construction industry applies to all occupational exposure in cadmium and all cadmium compounds in all forms, including fumes and dust, in all work construction where an employee may be potentially exposed to cadmium. Such work involves construction, alterations, and repairs. The activities include, but are not limited to, wrecking, demolishing, and salvaging structures where cadmium or cadmium-containing materials are present, cutting, brazing, grinding, or welding on surfaces that are painted with cadmium-containing paints, and transporting, storing, or disposing of cadmium or cadmium-containing materials on the site or location where construction activities are performed. This written program shall be reviewed and updated annually or more often to reflect significant changes in employers' compliance status. Health hazard information. Acute effects. Acute inhalation exposure to high levels of cadmium in humans may result in effects on the lung, such as bronchial or pulmonary irritation. A single acute exposure to high levels of cadmium can result in long-lasting impairment of lung function. Cadmium is considered to have high acute toxicity based on short-term animal tests in rats. Chronic inhalation and oral exposure of humans to cadmium results in a buildup of cadmium in the kidneys that can cause kidney disease, including proteinuria, a decrease in glomerular filtration rate, and an increased frequency of kidney stone formation. Other effects noted in occupational settings from chronic exposure of humans to cadmium in air are effects on the lung, including bronchiolitis and emphysema. Chronic inhalation or oral exposure of animals to cadmium results in effects on the kidney, liver, lung, bone, immune system, blood, and nervous system. Exposure monitoring. Plaas Incorporated shall ensure their employees are not exposed in excess of the permissible exposable level, PEL, of 5 micrograms per cubic meter of air as an 8-hour TWA. Plaas Incorporated shall provide for monitoring or measuring of employee exposure. Periodic monitoring shall be conducted at least every 6 months if initial monitoring shows employee exposure. Air monitoring will be performed at the beginning of each job task. If exposure monitoring results indicate exposure is above the PEL, Plaas Incorporated shall include in written program and notification the corrective action being taken to reduce exposure to or below the PEL action level. Significant exposure monitoring provisions of the cadmium standard for construction. Prior to performing any construction work where employees may be exposed to cadmium, Plaas Incorporated shall determine through a designated competent person whether cadmium is present in the workplace and whether there is a possibility that an employee may be exposed to cadmium at or above the action level. If the employee periodically performs tasks that may expose him or her to a higher concentration of airborne cadmium, then Plaas Incorporated shall monitor the employee while performing these tasks. Plaas Incorporated shall notify each affected employee in writing of the results and shall post the results in an appropriate location accessible to affected employees no later than 5 working days after the receiving of the results of any monitoring that is performed. Regulated areas. Regulated areas will be established when an employee's exposure is or is expected to be in excess of the PEL. Regulated areas shall be marked with warning signs to alert employees. Access is restricted to authorized persons. Regulated areas must be set apart from the rest of the workplace in a way that establishes and alerts employees the boundaries of the area. Be entered only by authorized persons. Be entered only by persons using proper respirators, and be accessible to employees who refrain from eating, drinking, smoking, chewing tobacco or gum, and applying cosmetics in such areas. Employees must not carry, store, or use products associated with such activities in these areas. Warning signs bearing the following information will be posted on all approaches to regulated areas. Danger, cadmium, cancer hazard, can cause lung and kidney disease. Authorized personnel only. Respirators required in this area. Plaas Incorporated shall establish regulated areas whenever the following construction activities are conducted. Electrical grounding with cadmium welding, cutting, brazing, burning, grinding, or welding on surfaces that are painted with cadmium-containing paints. Electrical work using cadmium-coated conduits, using cadmium-containing paints, cutting and welding cadmium-plated steel, brazing or welding with cadmium alloys, fusing of reinforced steel by cadmium welding, maintaining or retrofitting cadmium-coated equipment, and wrecking or demolishing where cadmium is present. Written compliance program. Plaas Incorporated shall establish and implement a written compliance program that describes how the company will reduce employee exposure to the PEL or below by the use of engineering and work practice controls and by the use of respiratory protection where permitted. The written compliance program shall be reviewed and updated as often as promptly as necessary to reflect any significant changes in the company's compliance and status. A designated competent person shall review the compliance program initially and after each change to ensure that the written program offers adequate employee protection from occupational exposure to cadmium. Upon request, the written compliance program will be made available for examination and copying to the Assistant Secretary for OSHA, the Director of the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, and affected employees and their designated representatives. Respiratory protection. Respirators shall be used when engineering controls and work practices cannot reduce employee exposure during work operations where engineering controls and work practices are not feasible and emergencies. Respirators shall be provided in accordance with 1910-134. Where applicable, Plaas Incorporated shall provide respirators at no cost to employees and ensure that they are used in compliance with the standard-powered air-purifying respirators shall be provided to employees who request them, and where this respirator will provide adequate protection. Plaas Incorporated shall ensure that employees use respirators in regulated areas and that the respirators are properly fitted and used. Employees required to wear respirators must have medical exams prior to the assigned area where respiratory protection is required, unless they've had a comparable exam within the preceding 12 months. Employees shall be allowed to leave a regulated area to readjust face pieces and to change filters or to wash their faces to avoid skin irritation. In emergency situations which involve a substantial release of cadmium, Plaas Incorporated shall ensure workers are protected by following all aspects of this program. This will include limiting access to authorized employees, provision and use of PPE, exposure monitoring, medical surveillance, hygiene facilities, work practices, fugitive emission controls, and proper disposal. A site-specific safety and health plan shall be developed in accordance with our HAZWOPER program. This plan will include such items as wind direction notification, primary and secondary emergency meeting evacuation points, and notification of emergency response personnel. Protective work clothing and equipment. PPE shall be provided at no cost to the employees where there is a hazard from skin and eye contact. glove, aprons, coveralls, goggles, foot covers, etc. Contaminated PPE will be removed at the end of the work shift. The Plaas Incorporated shall ensure that contaminated clothing and equipment are placed in closed containers in change rooms prior to cleaning, laundering, maintaining, or discarding. Plaas Incorporated shall provide clean and dry personal protective clothing and equipment at least weekly or more often as necessary to maintain effectiveness. Plaas Incorporated shall notify those who launder or clean these items of the potential hazards of cadmium exposure. Housekeeping. Surfaces shall be maintained as free as practical of accumulation of chromium. All spills and releases of chromium shall be cleaned promptly. Methods of cleaning include HEPA-filtered vacuums, dry or wet sweeping, shoveling, or other methods to minimize exposure. Plaas Incorporated shall ensure that waste, scrap, debris, bags, containers, equipment, and clothing contaminated with cadmium and consigned for disposal be collected and disposed of in sealed, impregnable bags or other closed, impermeable containers. These bags and containers shall be labeled according to the provisions of the rule and disposed of according to applicable federal, state, and local regulations. Hygiene facilities and practices. Plaas Incorporated shall provide change rooms for decontamination and ensure facilities prevent cross-contamination. Washing facilities shall be readily accessible for removing chromium from the skin. Workers must wash their hands and face or any other potentially exposed skin before eating, drinking, or smoking. Change rooms shall be equipped with separate storage facilities for street clothes and personal protective clothing equipment that shall be designed to prevent dispersing cadmium and containing the employee's street clothes. Before entering the lunch area, employees must clean or remove their protective clothing by HEPA vacuuming or some other removal method that does not disperse cadmium into the air. Also, employees exposed to cadmium above the PEL must shower at the end of work shift and must wash their hands and face prior to eating, drinking, smoking, chewing tobacco or gum, or applying cosmetics. Medical surveillance. Plaas Incorporated shall provide medical surveillance to employees who are exposed above action level or the PEL for 30 days or more per year or exposed in an emergency. Medical surveillance shall be provided when an employee experiences signs or symptoms of the adverse health effects of cadmium, dermatitis, asthma, bronchitis, etc. Medical surveillance shall be provided when an employee experiences signs or symptoms of the adverse health effects of cadmium, dermatitis, asthma, bronchitis, etc. Medical evaluations will be provided at no cost to employees. Examinations will be performed by or under the supervision of a physician or other licensed healthcare professional. Hazard training and communication. Plaas Incorporated shall provide training, initial training prior to or at the time of initial assignment. Plaas Incorporated shall provide training that is understandable and ensure each employee can demonstrate knowledge of the health hazards associated with cadmium exposure, location, manner of use, and release of cadmium in the workplace. Engineering controls and work practice controls. Purpose, proper selection, fitting, proper use, and limitations of respirators and protective clothing. Emergency procedures, measures employees can take to protect themselves from exposure. Purpose and description of medical surveillance program. Contents of all the standard plus of the standard. Plaas Incorporated shall make a copy readily available without cost to all infected employees. Training shall be documented. Plaas Incorporated shall certify that the training has been conducted by preparing a record that includes identity of employee trained, the signature of the person who conducted the training, and the date of the training. Records shall be kept for 1 year. Engineering and work practices. Plaas Incorporated shall implement engineering and work practice controls to reduce and maintain worker exposure to cadmium at or below the PEL. Engineering controls might include installing equipment, example, source point capture, or modifying a process, example, enclosure, to control employee exposure levels. Work practice controls include practices such as not eating, drinking, or applying cosmetics in regulated areas. Some of the provisions that Plaas Incorporated could include but are not limited to not using high-speed abrasive disc saws and similar abrasive power equipment unless such equipment has the appropriate engineering controls to minimize emissions and to meet the PEL. Materials containing cadmium should not be applied by spray methods if the exposures are above the PEL, unless employees are protected with certain specified respirators and measures are taken to limit overspray and prevent contamination of adjacent areas. Plaas Incorporated shall develop and implement procedures to minimize employee exposure to cadmium when maintaining ventilation systems and changing of filters. Plaas Incorporated shall implement a program in which each operation where cadmium is omitted, machinery used, material process, control in place, crew size, employee job responsibilities, and maintenance. In this program, a description of the specific means that will be employed to meet compliance, including engineering plans. A report of technology considered in meeting the PEL. Air monitoring data. A detailed schedule for implementation. A written plan for emergency situations. Other relevant information.